It's January in Scandinavia, around 1,000 years ago. The sun barely climbs above the horizon, the ground is frozen, snow covers the fields. The sea is dark and cold, and the wind coming off it cuts through anything that isn't properly prepared. There is no central heating, no electricity, no supermarket waiting around the corner with fresh food. And if your fire goes out in the middle of the night, you can't exactly turn up the thermostat. Yet, this wasn't some extraordinary survival challenge for the Vikings. This was winter, they knew it was coming every year, and that changes the question. Because the Vikings weren't somehow surviving Scandinavian winter through sheer toughness. They had spent generations figuring out how to live with it. Their houses, clothing, food, animals, work, and even the way they organized their year were built around the fact that winter was coming. And once you understand how they did it, something becomes obvious. The Vikings didn't defeat winter, they prepared for it months before it arrived. Let's start with a place where most of the winter was actually spent, the Viking longhouse. From the outside, it might look almost ridiculous compared with a modern house. No glass windows, no insulation made from modern materials, no furnace humming in the basement, just timber, earth, turf, thatch, and a roof. But the important thing wasn't what the house looked like, it was how the entire structure worked. A typical longhouse was long, relatively narrow, and built with a large central space. And right in the middle was one of the most important inventions in Viking life, the hearth. Fire wasn't decoration, it was the heating system, the cooking system, the source of light, and in many cases, the center of social life. A winter evening might mean dozens of people gathered inside the same building while the fire burned in the middle. The smoke didn't disappear through some modern chimney. It could escape through openings in the roof, leaving the inside hazy and smoky. Not exactly the Scandinavian version of luxury, but there was an advantage. A large group of people generates heat. So does a large fire. And the longhouse kept that heat concentrated inside one enclosed space instead of spreading it through multiple rooms. The Vikings were essentially heating people in a building together, and the materials mattered too. Thick timber walls and turf could help slow the movement of heat. In places such as Iceland, turf became especially important because it was abundant and could be layered over structures to provide additional protection from the cold. The goal wasn't to make the inside tropical, it was to make the inside less hostile than the outside. And that was enough. Because the Vikings didn't need to walk around their houses in t-shirts, they just needed somewhere where the fire could keep working faster than winter could steal the heat. Now imagine walking outside. It's freezing, the wind is blowing, and you have to go collect firewood, or check the animals, or repair something, or travel to another settlement. Your house can't come with you, so your second line of defense is what you're wearing. Viking clothing was built mostly from materials that were available in their environment and through trade. Wool was especially valuable. And there's a very good reason for that. Wool remains useful at keeping you warm even when it gets damp. That matters enormously in Scandinavia, where cold weather and wet weather often arrive together. They also use linen for clothing, leather for various items, and fur and skins where available. And layering mattered. A Viking didn't need one magical piece of clothing that defeated winter. They needed several layers that trapped warm air close to the body. It's the same basic principle behind modern cold weather clothing. The difference is that the Vikings were doing it without synthetic insulation or waterproof jackets. And then, there's something people often forget. Clothing wasn't just about temperature, it was also about movement. A farmer couldn't spend the entire day wrapped in something so heavy that he couldn't work. A sailor couldn't fight the wind and waves while wearing clothing that became useless the moment it got wet. So clothing had to balance warmth, flexibility, durability, and whatever materials were actually available. That sounds obvious, but getting that balance right was the difference between being uncomfortable and being in real danger. The real winter battles started months earlier. Here's where the whole thing gets interesting. You cannot survive a Scandinavian winter by improvising in December. By then, it's already too late. The real survival strategy began in spring and summer. Because winter doesn't just bring cold, it brings scarcity. Plants stop growing, some animals become harder to hunt. Travel becomes more difficult, and depending on where you lived, storms and ice could isolate communities for long periods, so during the warmer months, Vikings had to build up a reserve. Food was preserved through drying, smoking, salting, fermentation, and other methods. Fish could be dried, meat could be preserved, dairy products could be turned into forms that lasted longer, grain could be stored, and livestock became incredibly important. Because an animal wasn't just an animal, it was food. It could provide milk, it could provide wool, and eventually it could become meat. That means the Viking winter wasn't simply, how do we stay warm? It was, How do we make sure we still have enough food when almost nothing is growing? That is a much harder problem. And the answer was basically an ancient version of meal prepping, except if you messed up your meal prep, you didn't order pizza. They ate whatever the landscape could give them. Viking diets weren't identical everywhere. A farmer in Denmark had different possibilities from someone living in Iceland or northern Norway. But the general strategy was diversification: fish, meat, dairy, grains, vegetables, berries, nuts, wild plants, whatever could be grown, raised, hunted, caught, gathered, traded, or preserved. And preservation was everything. Imagine catching a huge amount of fish during a productive season. You have two choices: eat all of it immediately and then have nothing later, or figure out how to make it last. The second option is obviously better, so fish could be dried or salted and stored for later. And this is one reason the Viking world was much less primitive than the stereotype suggests. They weren't simply walking around looking for something to kill every morning. They were managing food supplies across seasons. Because winter rewards people who planned ahead, and punishes people who didn't. There's another resource winter could destroy: fuel. You need fire to cook. You need fire to stay warm. You need fire for light. And depending on the settlement, you might need enormous amounts of fuel over the course of a long winter. That means collecting firewood wasn't some occasional household chore. It could become a major part of seasonal preparation. And this is where Viking communities had another advantage. They didn't survive as isolated individuals. They survived as households and communities. Someone could collect wood, someone could tend animals, someone could prepare food, someone could repair clothing, someone could maintain tools, someone could watch the fire. Everyone's labor contributed to keeping everyone alive. And that becomes incredibly important when winter arrives, because one person trying to do everything is vulnerable, a community isn't. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about Viking life. We imagine Vikings constantly raiding, sailing, fighting, and exploring, but you can't spend the entire winter behaving like you're starring in an action movie. The environment doesn't care how brave you are, storms don't care, frozen ground doesn't care. So life became more seasonal, agricultural work slowed, outdoor activity could become more limited, and people spent more time indoors. That didn't mean everyone simply sat around doing nothing, quite the opposite. Winter was useful for work that could be done inside. Clothing could be made and repaired, tools could be maintained, wood could be worked, stories could be told, people could socialize, plans could be made, and skills could be passed from one generation to another. In other words, winter wasn't necessarily the dead season. It was the season when different kinds of work became important. And then there's the darkness. Cold is one problem, but Scandinavia has another: light. The further north you go, the shorter the winter days become. For Viking communities living at high latitudes, winter could mean incredibly long periods of darkness compared with what people in southern Europe experienced. There was no electric lighting, no LED bulbs, no phone screen lighting up your bedroom at midnight. You had firelight, oil lamps in some contexts, and daylight. That's it. So imagine finishing your work and entering a longhouse while outside it's already dark. The fire becomes the center of the room. People gather around it. Someone cooks, someone repairs something, someone tells a story, someone drinks, someone argues, someone falls asleep. And eventually, the entire building settles into the rhythm of winter. This is one reason Viking culture placed such importance on storytelling and oral tradition. A long winter evening is a very different experience when you have nothing to watch. No television, no internet, no YouTube. You have people and stories. So winter wasn't just something that had to be endured, it was also when communities became more tightly connected. But what happened when the weather got really bad? This is where preparation stopped being optional. A Scandinavian storm could make travel dangerous very quickly. Snow could cover paths. Ice could make roads difficult. Strong winds could make sailing impossible. And getting lost in a winter landscape wasn't an inconvenience. It could be fatal. So Vikings had to understand their environment. They knew seasonal weather patterns. They knew where settlements were. They knew which routes were practical. They understood coastlines, rivers, mountains, and landmarks. And their famous ships weren't just useful for raiding. Ships were transportation networks. They connected communities. They moved people, animals, food, timber, iron, textiles, and other goods. Trade mattered because no settlement had everything. The British Museum notes that Viking communities traded commodities including wool, fish, wood, iron, fur, leather, and walrus ivory, while importing things such as silver, spices, wine, pottery, glass, and other goods. So surviving winter wasn't always about producing everything yourself. Sometimes it was about being connected to people who had something you didn't. And that may have been the biggest Viking advantage Think about the problem again. It's freezing outside, the days are short, food is limited, travel is dangerous, and your house has no furnace. You might think the secret must have been some incredible Viking technology, but it wasn't. It was preparation. The house was prepared, the clothing was prepared, the food was prepared, the animals were prepared, the fuel was prepared, the community was prepared, and most importantly, the entire year was organized around the knowledge that winter was coming. That's the part modern people can easily miss. We think of winter as a weather event. The Vikings experienced it as a seasonal system. Summer wasn't just summer, it was the time to grow food, to gather, to fish, to preserve, to repair, to build, to prepare. Because every extra piece of food stored in autumn could become another meal in February. Every bundle of firewood could become another warm night. Every repaired roof could become one less problem during a storm. And every person who knew how to perform an important task made the entire community harder to break. And this is where the Viking story gets interesting. We often imagine these people as almost superhuman. Hard men and women who simply looked at freezing temperatures and said, "We'll survive." But that's not really what happened. They weren't immune to cold. They weren't magically stronger than everyone else. And winter could absolutely kill people. A bad harvest could become a food crisis. A failed season could leave families vulnerable. A serious storm could destroy property or isolate a settlement. Cold didn't care whether you were a Viking warrior or a farmer. The difference was that these people had generations of experience living in the same environment. They knew what winter was going to demand from them, and they prepared accordingly. The fire, the wool, the turf, the dried fish, the stored grain, the animals, the community, the long winter evenings. None of these things alone was a miracle. But put them together, and they created something surprisingly powerful. A society that could function in a place where winter was not a temporary inconvenience. It was one of the defining conditions of life. So the Vikings didn't survive the Scandinavian winter because they were tougher than winter. They survived because they respected it. They knew it was coming, and by the time the first serious snow arrived, they had already spent half the year preparing for it. The real Viking survival strategy wasn't strength. It was being ready, and maybe that's the most impressive part. Because when winter finally arrived, the Vikings weren't asking, "How are we going to survive this?" They had been answering that question since spring.